Thank you, Mike, and thank you to the Center for having me here today. It's quite an honor to speak to this group and with such a great panel of folks that I was able to work with in my government job and appear with in different settings as well. I wanted to begin with a tip of the hat to Mike Devereaux himself and some of the work that he and colleagues have done in the area of the cash flow taxes, the destination cash flow tax. But I want to use it as a jumping off point for discussion of the broader issue of kind of stability and what's happening in international taxation and business. Without getting into the political issues of liking the destination cash flow tax or not, or the particular flavor that's currently being discussed in the United States, I think it's important for an audience like this to appreciate that what the folks working on that really zeroed in on were things that I discovered in the BEPS work at the OECD were really key problems in the areas of international business tax. The first, of course, is what we call in the tax world the mobility of intellectual property or capital. Because those of us who understand that if you can put your capital anywhere in the world and have it taxed there, including in tax havens, you've stressed the system from the other jurisdictions where there are other activities going on. And the ease of movement of capital puts a stress on the system. The same thing occurs with the ownership of intellectual property, because you ask yourself, well, what does it mean to own intellectual property in a place? And, you know, again, without going into all the details, what we have seen are the stressors in the current system where the tension between the taxpayers and the tax authorities largely fall around this question of, well, where do I put this intellectual property and what does it mean for it to be there? And that's been a lot of the debate that took a lot of our time in BEPS. And third is what we call the fragility of, what I call the fragility of this residence concept. You know, Mike mentioned opening up that we're building on years of a particular tax system and years of institutions that have been built around that tax system. And at the center of that is a notion that the residents of a country gets taxed under the rules of that country, including very often the foreign income earned in different ways, you know, by that entity that is, quote, resident in that country. And what we learned in the United States was, with our inversion problem, is that residency is fragile. And some jurisdictions are better at policing it and protecting it than others, but even if you can police it and protect it for your longtime companies, like you can't leave whatever country, Germany, Italy, the United States, there's always ramifications from the economist's point of view and legal perspective of, well, if I'm starting up a brand new entity, you know, where would I be? And that is harder to put a fence around before a concept gets going. So the residency concept has been a stressor that caused us a great deal of issues in BEPS. And the residency concept, to my mind, gets very close to another fine idea, which is the fine in the sense of refined, the jurisdiction to tax. When I first got my job at Treasury and I started to work on the Digital Economy Task Force, I was a lifelong practitioner, so I did not spend my time thinking about jurisdiction to tax. But I went back, Mike Gratz has a great article about the history of, you know, tax law, treaties, et cetera. And because I was really searching for the answer to the question of, is there a magic, is there a formula, is there a natural law, if you will, of jurisdiction to tax? And the answer really is no. We've built up some conventions around it, permanent establishment being one, or requiring a certain presence in the country before you can tax. But as Mike Gratz points out in his articles, you know, that was a point of agreement done for a lot of different practical reasons, but it isn't something that has to be. And so even in the income tax area, this question of jurisdiction to tax is fluid. But then if you look at a VAT, you know, and you say to yourself, it's really interesting to me that in the same world where we fight so much about jurisdiction to tax on the income side, we have all rather naturally accepted the notion that if you're selling your goods into another jurisdiction, that the other jurisdiction has the jurisdiction to tax the goods arriving in the jurisdiction. So even on concepts of jurisdiction to tax, you wind up with a very strange tension of Do I need to have this discussion solely in the silo of I'm in a direct tax, an indirect tax, what about an excise tax? And it all becomes very fluid and difficult. The reason I wanted to warm up that way is when I began in BEPS, I would meet with some of these wonderful academics, and we'd have these really great discussions. But you have to realize, in BEPS, we were given a 2-year timeline to come up with 15 reports. And what I quickly realized was, again, I'm not an academic, I didn't spend my life thinking about these things, and said, oh my goodness, they've brought the old Model T into the shop, and they said, could you fix a few things on it so it can go back out on the road and do another, 20 miles or so, right? And so the BEPS process was, I think, as Mike alluded to, very much kind of fixing and trying to work around the edges of the old architecture. And in that sense, I think we kind of did the best we could. So what is the state of play, after the BEPS project, in light of that kind of lineup? And I wanted to start, I've decided I'd become Mr. Sunshine in my new role here. Georgia Maffini, by the way, who's one of the most wonderful economists, and she now works at the OECD, and she's doing digital, and she's terrific. So when I spoke, the OECD always got a little nervous whether they were going to experience the good Bob or the bad Bob, as if I was like bipolar or something. I'm not, I don't think so. But in any event, there is a benefit to shining some light on some of the positive things that are going on in the world in this space. Because, as I get older, right, change takes time. And let me just go for a few of the really cool things that are going on. And let me start with the problem that first got me very interested in the Certainty Project. The problem I observed as a member of the US government was the finance ministers would often come in to see the Treasury Secretary, and they'd say, we really need more US investment in our country. And I, as the tax person, would say, are you kidding? Do you know what it's like to do business in your country for businesses? And that brought to me this idea of these kind of silos in governments, and having been in government, they're siloed. The finance guys want investment. The tax guys are often given, hey, you raise, $2 billion next quarter or else. And so the silos are not really communicating. And the goal of the Certainty Project was to try to, in my mind, marry together the goals of the government that want to increase investment while at the same time having appropriate tax rules so they can collect the revenues they need and in a manner that's efficient enough not to drive away the investment. So it's a balancing act. And this was drawn home to me. I went down to Brazil on one of the trips with one of the undersecretaries, and I was visiting the US companies in Brazil. Obviously, a lot of US companies do business in Brazil. A lot of them do business in India. And why? Because the market's there. And they're going to be there because they can serve that market with their products. It's kind of a given. It's kind of another element of the destination cash flow. But what drove home to me the importance of the project we're going to talk about today on Certainty is, under what circumstance will a company do anything more, one iota more in that jurisdiction, than serve the market, unless the finance ministries and the tax administrations are working together to make an environment in which it's desirable to not only serve that market, but maybe put up the factory that serves, the nearby markets. So what are some positive things happening? Well, I was at Courmayeur, Italy a few days ago, and just look in the Italian government, how they're really focusing on trying to dig into the issues of tax administration in Italy, to streamline things, work on issues like what we call in tax cooperative compliance. Wouldn't it be good if instead of waiting 7 years and having an audit, you just kind of go in advance and agree to the tax and get the issues on the table so that doing business becomes a more predictable and certain event? And the Italian government's working at that. The Italian government has a serious problem with the Guardia di Finanza, so you can literally have what you think is a routine tax problem, and the tax police show up with sirens blaring, and I don't know if they draw the guns, but they apparently have them. And the next thing you know, your civil tax dispute has turned into a problem. And just yesterday I heard an anecdote of a guy who got raided in front of his children. He was setting up a new solar panel company or something in Italy, and 3 days later he left the country. I mean, but to the positive, Italy is focused on how can we streamline administration, still meet our goals, but create a better environment. The work that takes me to the next piece of work. The work that came out of the BEPS on MAP. When two countries want to tax the same income, how do we resolve that dispute? And the really important thing, and the work at the OECD in this space is really good because it's going to create political atmosphere in which countries can come together and peer review each other about how good they are in resolving those technical disputes. Now, why is that important? It really isn't about the technical disputes that actually get to the top. But if down through the system, everybody knows that the position I take on audit is going to get tested as it moves up the chain under the rules, then you have to expect kind of an improvement down through the administration. So we're playing, by the rules, the rule of law, and things of that nature. And finally, the fact that in the MLI that was just signed, a bunch of countries signed up for arbitration. Again, that means when we get these disputes, we'll go out to a third party and say, you tell us. All of these things should have beneficial effects for the rule of law and beneficial effects for kind of tax administration, as it moves down the chain. I want to be very conscious of my time. So that's Mr. Sunshine. Those are the happy things. But they're important, and they shouldn't be underestimated, and the OECD plays a very strong and important role in that space. Okay, now what are the challenges? Well, I'll just tick off a few because I don't want to go long. Obviously, the uncertainty of U.S. tax reform hangs over the picture, gives us the size of the U.S. economy. I want to zero in on one element of that, sub-element of that, though, which is something I thought about in government, which is stability of the system. By that I mean, the system kind of holds together across countries, so there aren't that many opportunities to strip into pure tax havens or create too much tax competition, incentives, so that everybody's playing a game and we keep this incredible pressure on the system. And the only question I have thought about while I was in government is, if every country does territorial, haven't we left outside your country to be kind of the Wild West for everybody? And won't that, encourage multinationals to kind of play the Wild West games, but then encourage reaction in the governments to say, hey, let's stop that and have this draconian measure or other. So I think of tax reform connected to stability. I'm not sure anybody else does, but I think that's a challenge. The supply chain, this whole issue of how companies have tried to reduce their costs by redoing their supply chains, usually for real business purposes, actually is a very hidden pressure on the system. Because what's happened is, as you have reduced your functions in countries around the world, the tax people see a lot less revenue in their jurisdiction, and that has fueled attention, including attention where countries are busily looking to see whether your parent entity actually has what we call a permanent establishment in my country, and that's another area today where there's enormous instability, and that still actually involves the tax police in Italy. Country by country reports, you may know, the multinationals will now start reporting around the world, and then to use it appropriately is going to be a challenge, as opposed to turning it into backdoor formulary. Tax competition is going to continue to be a challenge for governments as they're trying to make sure they have the revenue they need. And let me just end on a point, and this, I'm going to get a little more negative here, and I apologize in advance. But the problem, the OECD was like, let's come together and do consensus. And I think that the European reaction to a lot of the BEPS has made it more difficult for the United States to come to the OECD and do consensus. And the two examples I might use is the DPT, the diverted profits tax in the UK. Okay, we're all sitting around the table having consensus. Oh, never mind, we'll just do what we want. So does it create an environment in which a country like the US says, oh, let's do consensus again, that was so much fun. And then, when we agreed to have country-by-country reports exchanged through governments, which was a huge step for many countries to take, and the ink wasn't dry on that consensus, and the European Parliament says, oh, how about we put it on the web? And how about we pass a law? And how about we force everyone in Europe to do that, okay? So the message back, I think, is we're in a fragile, difficult position, but building multilateral consensus takes a certain amount of commitment to a respect for consensus when it's reached. We did not feel that, I don't think, at the end of the day in BEPS, and while we don't have time to talk about it today, the next big issue is this so-called taxation of the digital economy, where Georgia works, and that is going to feel the effects of the notion at the OECD that Europe takes a consensus as a floor and then triples down on whatever it agreed to, which is going to make it hard for other governments to get there. Okay, final word, bottom line, we do need to reconcile the basic need of governments for revenue with a certain degree of predictability and certainty so that foreign direct investment grows, so that global growth grows. Very tricky business. We have a whole day to talk more about it, and thank you for having me.